You seem a little on edge.
Not at all.
Welcome, Gothamites, to another episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, the psychologist of the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City, and now a galaxy far, far away, Dr. Drea Letamendi. Hello, Drea.
Hi, Brian.
Wow, it's been a crazy couple of weeks. The last episode we did went up while we were at Star Wars Celebration, which we were supposed to go to in 2020. And obviously, a certain pandemic kept us from doing it. So we ended up going this year in Anaheim, California. Drea, this was the second Star Wars Celebration we've ever attended. The first time that you've ever been on a panel. Congratulations.
Thank you. This is the first Celebration panel I've ever done. And it's been on my, professional bucket list for a while. Simply because I love Star Wars and I love writing about Star Wars, obviously talking about Star Wars. And I have a chapter coming up actually on Star Wars and psychology. So it's been on my mind to eventually be on a panel. And it was so lovely. Everybody was excellent. The panelists, the hosts, the crowds.
Specifically, this panel was the psychology of Episode 2,
Not
Attack
really.
of the Clones.
It was
it was the science.
It was
yes.
the science
Yes.
of Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. We're 20 years out from the original release of Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, which is so wild when I say this out loud. It's been 20 years since we've seen this movie. Being on the panel and talking about the psychology of the film allowed me to appreciate it a bit more. And then hearing from other professionals, we had experts who were geologists, physicists, engineers, folks who worked on the film, folks who work in Lucasfilm and in special effects. So it was actually quite an honor to be a part of that conversation. And if folks want to hear it, you can go to, wherever you hear podcasts, you'll find it at Star Warsologies. It's episode 17. And I hope you enjoy it.
Overall, what were your feelings on Star Wars Celebration 2022?
I enjoyed it very much. It is a 4-day show, and I don't know that we need 4 days of one IP, one franchise. It feels like quite, I don't know. It's a little bloated, but not in a it's that feel-good bloat. It feels good.
I suppose so. Yeah, I agree with you. I think my biggest complaint about the show...
Gosh, there were some. I mean, that app...
The app was buggy.
Really buggy.
The staff didn't really seem to know much about what was going on. I agree with you. I don't feel like it's a 4-day show. I think it's a 2-day show. The floor is a decent size, but you're basically walking through what feels like a glorified flea market for the most part. Though there are some big booths that have, Sideshow was obviously there with some really big things. You obviously had
very high-end flea market.
Well, but what I'm saying is, in the same way that a regular convention also feels like a flea market for the most part, you at least have variety. You have comics down on this end. You have various toy vendors. Then you've got T-shirt vendors, and then you've got high-end collectibles. And here it was either you were buying $1,500 to $2,000 statues, or you were buying toys from the 80s that were probably not in very good condition. And so I didn't feel like it was difficult to walk the floor. I do love certain things about this floor that other conventions don't have. There's an entire corner dedicated to 20 some odd tattoo artists. So it's like if you want to get a Star Wars tattoo.
And that's been a staple of Celebration. I recall that in the year that we went as well. I certainly would recommend, if you can get to a celebration
Yeah.
one of these years. Next year it's in London.
Yeah.
So
Good luck.
that's-
Good luck with that,
Good luck
Drea.
getting there. But for some people, actually, that might, for some of our listeners,
In London.
they're right there. And let me just say, we have friends who have joined the Read Pop family. I hope that this is the beginning of improvements.
Yeah.
I did hear from people that they felt like this was better than other previous Read Pop shows.
That's good.
And, look, we're coming back from a pandemic. There are a lot of new protocols and measures that they're handling, and not everything is going to be perfect.
I felt like the most interesting things that we saw there were panels. And when you go to the celebration stage, which if you're talking Comic-Con terms, this would be Hall H.
Yeah.
There were, I think, a grand total of, and I could be wrong about this, somebody's going to look it up and correct me, but I think there were maybe 9 panels all weekend, over all 4 days in that giant stage. One of the things I do appreciate is that they clear out the room, so you can't just set up camp inside the celebration stage and see all the panels. You have to basically pick and choose which ones you want to get in line for. But as a result, each day only had 2, maybe 3 panels in that gigantic stage. Everything else was a fan run panel, which if you're a fan wanting to run a panel, that's great. You got pretty good odds, but they tended to get pretty repetitive. And I just didn't think it was a 4-day show. But Saturday though defined the weekend for me. We had a lot of great experiences on Saturday. We got to see a panel, Doug Chang, a hero of mine, a designer hero of mine, talked about designing The Mandalorian and Boba Fett. That was pretty interesting. We saw sort of a late night comedy cabaret with Anthony Daniels doing his panel. He likes for it to be fun rather than a straight Q&A. That was a lot of fun. We got to see Pedro Pascal on the celebration
awesome.
live stage just by accident. We happened to be walking by as that happened, and we were like, wonder who the next guest is going to be. We walked right up and then got nearly crushed by by the wave of people who clearly love Pedro Pascal. Saturday I thought was a really great day, and if that, I think that experience alone really made celebration for me. But yeah, I overall I enjoyed it. I think it's a 2-day show. We had a ton of emails come in over the last couple weeks, Drea.
I'm so curious to learn how folks are doing with the transition we made from everything we've been doing, right? From DC, Marvel, Little Steven Universe, and going into Star Wars. I've gotten a few notes from folks who are excited, mostly welcoming messages and excited messages from people who love Star Wars or who are curious about the psychology of Star Wars. So it was good to see that. What are your thoughts about moving into Star Wars?
I'm excited for it to some degree. The prequels are not my Star Wars per se.
This is where we got to start, though.
This is where we have to start in order
where it all began.
To maintain our viewing the evolution of the characters. But even at Celebration, it was very clear that the prequels are a lot of people's Star Wars. So there are a lot of people that are excited about hearing what you have to say about these characters. And a few of them have tweeted us, they have Facebooked us, they have DM'd us in various ways. They have talked about their just being extremely excited about hearing you talk about the psychology of Star Wars. So I think they have a lot to look forward to. We ran a Patreon poll for the last couple of weeks that asked if you wanted us to include the 2 movies, Rogue One and Solo, in our collection, and it was a resounding yes. I think only 3 people voted not to include those movies. So we will be including Solo and Rogue One where they are supposed to go in the timeline. I don't know that they're going to have a whole lot to add to the greater Skywalker saga, but we can certainly talk about the characters that are in those movies. And so a lot of people are looking forward to that. I got to go back real quick, though, when you're right, you're right. When I'm wrong, and I admit it. Natalie Nina Stravins DM'd us on Instagram and wanted to talk a little bit about Endgame, our episode of Endgame. And I love what she had to say, because we had criticized basically the Loki series, saying that Loki was sort of unjustified because Renslayer had said that what the Avengers did was appropriate and planned, but what Loki had done was not.
Yeah.
And she was kind enough to point out, she said the whole issue with Renslayer saying what the Avengers did was supposed to happen, contradicting the fact that Loki stole the Tesseract, therefore changing their mission as well. She didn't really find it to be an inconsistency, because we find out later that He Who Remains wanted Loki to end up there all along. Renslayer simply gets her information from the Timekeepers, and he obviously would have no issue lying to her about the truth of the TVA, let alone what he wants the Lokis for. He needs the TVA to capture Loki, so he would have to manufacture a quote-unquote crime to kick off his adventures with the TVA. She's absolutely right. Renslayer saying in the beginning, you weren't supposed to do this, this was a Nexus event.
Yeah.
Is said at the end by He Who Remains that he knew they were going to end up in front of him all along. So, I love that. Thank you so much. It's obviously been a long time since we've watched Loki. We covered Loki back when we covered Avengers, like right afterward. So there's been some time. Natalie, you were absolutely right. Thank you for DMing us. There was another email, this one from Gabriel Santa Maria, talking about Phantom Menace and our episode on that. He says, big fan. Yours is the first podcast I ever started listening to, and I don't listen to too many. Back in 2017. Love the show. Keep doing what you're doing. My friend and I have gotten into some discussions and have a hot take on Star Wars. It's a fantasy story in disguise as sci-fi. There's a few, but the main point is the religion known as the Force gives you powers. The fact that this invisible thing that the most of the universe doesn't practice or acknowledge, but also controls a lot of the governments in its storyline. Is there no separation of church and state? This is interesting, right? Because when we first hear about the Force in episode 4, even Han is like, some hokey religion and some mumbo jumbo is no match for a good blaster by your side. It's true. A lot of the universe don't acknowledge the Jedi. They feel like their religion died out a long time ago. No big deal. And yet we see that the Force is a pretty driving factor in politics.
Yeah, and even to the degree that even though the Jedi aren't necessarily out front and center driving those politics publicly, they are in the background influencing various politicians, but also potentially impacting for lack of a better word, the culture of things, the spirit of things.
Yeah.
That their Jedi Council has this huge high impact on how decisions are made, that things eventually lead back to these religious practices. And yeah, I'd say that's I still agree that this is science fiction, but
well, I see what they mean, but and I think he's right. I think it's science fiction. I think you're right as well. But he's absolutely right. It's a fantasy story. I mean, you've got all the fantasy archetypes. You've got the wizards. You've got the pirates. You've got the princess stuck in a tower. You've got the evil wizard that they're trying to rescue her from. I mean, you have the farm boy, a reluctant hero. You have all the archetypes of a fantasy story. 100%. There's no question about that. And I don't think George Lucas has ever even denied that. I think he's, flat out said he kind of wanted to make a fantasy story set in a sort of Flash Gordon environment.
Right.
So good observation there. Another email. This one from Heath Stevens says, I was listening to your most recent podcast about episode 1, The Phantom Menace. I was reminded of a podcast by Alistair Stevens from a few years ago. The title was Story and Star Wars, and he made a good argument using literary elements and a bit of Jungian Campbellian psychology that the prequel trilogy was more of the story of Obi-Wan rather than Anakin/Vader or Qui-Gon Jinn or even Palpatine. He also definitely agrees that they are mostly concerned with the failure and the fall of the Jedi too. Thought you guys might want to have a listen or read as it could influence some of the particular psychology tenets and character development that you discussed throughout this journey. I'm curious what you think about, I don't know anything about Jungian/Campbellian psychology.
Well, you know a little bit about Campbellian psychology.
Yes, but I mean, I don't know enough to be like, here I'm pointing out the Jungian/Campbellian psychology of this. But what do you think? Do you think this is more Obi-Wan's prequel trilogy than Qui-Gon? It's obviously not Qui-Gon's trilogy.
Sure, not anymore. We've got to hold some of this until the end of the trilogy to really get there. I certainly would agree that this is about these efforts and attempts to balance out.
Bring balance
to the community and to rely on these individual figures to lead us or to lead the Jedi, and therefore to impact the balance of the universe, including its politicians and intergalactic leadership. And there's a great failure at the end of this quest that we'll probably talk about, but this idea that so much was, so many expectations and assumptions were made out of one leader. And those dreams, those fantasies, those assumptions not only fell flat, but were devastating.
We want to thank everyone for emailing, tweeting, DMing. Get in touch with us any way that you can, because we liked hearing your comments and we like talking about them on the show. So we appreciate that. We should probably get into actually talking about Obi-Wan's prequel trilogy, and by that I mean episode 2, Attack of the Clones.
So now we're on the same page that the protagonist of this film and maybe the next film is
Obi-Wan?
Anakin?
Palpatine?
Maybe still Palpatine?
Well, again, I think that the driving force of the entire prequel trilogy is Palpatine, but but I still think it's an ensemble piece. I think that George Lucas intended to make a trilogy of movies that were all about the fall of Anakin Skywalker, and the second trilogy, which would have been the original trilogy, would have been the resurrection of Anakin Skywalker. So I think it was always intended for this series of movies to be about the fall and re-rise of Anakin.
I agree.
But I don't see him as being the lead character necessarily in the movies. More in this one. There's a lot more with Anakin in this movie, as we get to see a lot more of the facets of his relationships with other people, which are apparently bad in the culture of Jedi.
I mean, well, in our culture as well. I'd say that our conversation is likely going to be centered around not just Anakin as a character, but his poor decision-making, his propensity for violence, his descent into the dark side. That's, I think, what the story is telling us for the next 2 movies. The first movie was setting up who this little kid is and where he came from, and what his community is telling him, what messages they're giving him about his entitled rank. And the next 2 films are really about the failures and the pitfalls of those beliefs, of holding those values. And as a part of this conversation, I should probably say, and I maybe should have said this in the beginning of our episode, that we will talk about his violence, that we've got to address and explore where that violence comes from and how that violence manifests in our communities. And I mean, this is on our minds, right? We're watching these clips and testimonies from the January 6th insurrection. We're sitting here processing and grieving multiple mass shootings, losses of young people, losses of marginalized individuals and groups. And so this movie, 20 years later, is actually telling us a lot about what can lead a person to make some of these decisions that they're making around their bitterness, their resentment, their hatred, their anger. And those are all the things that I know we talked about in the first episode that Yoda warned us about, and that from the very, first movie in the late 70s, we were starting to think about what happens when we feel these emotions in our bodies. What are we supposed to do with those feelings? And what if we feel out of control?
I want to ask about, I don't know where to start really, because it's 10 years later. Padme is no longer queen of Naboo. She's now a senator. She's now gone straight up into the Senate. There's an assassination attempt on her. We then meet Obi-Wan, who is 10 years older, 10 years wiser, 10 years wider, 10 years wiser. Definitely more of a Qui-Gon-like figure to Anakin now. He now has taken on that role of his tutor, his mentor. He kind of treats him like a student. He's not quite the brother that we later hear about. We're not talking about that though. But he is constantly sort of slapping Anakin's hand for being impetuous, for being too emotional, for being too off the cuff, for being too eager to jump head first, which, by the way, you brought up may have been Anakin or it may have been Obi-Wan at one point, maybe even in The Phantom Menace. I still think I saw a little bit more restraint in The Phantom Menace when it came to his relationship with Qui-Gon. But what do you think about older Obi-Wan now, 10 years after young apprentice Padawan Anakin, Jedi Knight, but not yet Jedi Knight until the end? What do you think?
How does it go? Is it Jedi Master, Jedi Knight, and then you're on the council? Is that the...
Maybe.
That's the ascent.
You're asking the wrong person. You're the one who used to have a podcast on
I should
Star Wars. I think you're probably right.
Facts.
Yeah, you're probably in there.
My sense is that he does feel the burden of doing right by his mentor, Qui-Gon. That he maybe did not fully believe that this young child was going to bring balance to the universe, but certainly he respected and honored his mentor and wanted to fulfill his responsibilities and duty to mentor this young kid. I think, and I know he doesn't call him a brother in this film, but I think there is a growing camaraderie that goes beyond just that we're collegial. Like I think there's something familial there. He does feel responsible for him, and I do find it interesting that it's Padme that is requiring protection because she's being targeted by assassins and she's needing this like high level security, and it's kind of a weird move. They send the two Jedi to protect her. But they set her up in a high-rise apartment in Coruscant with like all these giant windows and an obviousness about where she is. It's kind of a hidden but not hidden situation. But nonetheless, these two are asked to look after her, and That's kind of a weird setup, but I think it's necessary for then Padme to fall in love with Anakin. That's the necessary component of this movie.
Okay, so now you've brought it up. We got to talk about it. Anakin, you've grown. We should talk about the really creepy moment of seeing this young boy that you once took a Jabor snippet from in the cold depths of space. You rescued him from slavery. You watched him pod race his way to freedom. You watched him help take down the Trade Federation in a big galactic battle, almost by accident. And now, 10 years later, he's a hunk right in front of you. Clearly, there's a little bit of an attraction there. I need you to tell me why this is okay.
I believe that they have not seen each other in 10 years.
Oh, correct.
Right? And that's actually a part of the story that is somewhat unconvincing, because how would they have not? It's not as if there's a ton of Jedi, and he's pretty close to the council. He's pretty close to the main players here. So
and thus the Senate.
Weird. Yeah,
and
it's a little weird. But nonetheless.
But he's also not a Jedi Knight. He has been for 10 years an apprentice. He's basically been catching up. So where all those little kids are when they're all the little younglings, like,
is that his own class?
I mean, they're like 10 years ahead of him at this point. I mean, they were taking
What's
taking
that
small
Adam
children.
Sandler movie? It's like that, where he's the big kid or the adult man,
Yeah.
holding a lightsaber with a bunch of the little Padawans, around him.
Yeah, he's got to basically have a private tutor in Obi-Wan, simply because you can't put him. It'd be like it'd be like a 20-year-old man going into Taekwondo with a bunch of 6-year-olds.
It's good that you're mentioning this, because these are some of the seeds or the origins of feeling resentful, of feeling held back, of feeling that others in your community aren't giving you what you want or what you deserve. We'll talk more about this, but that growing sense of entitlement is partly his fault, but partly the messages that he's given by his elders.
Right.
So if I were to say, if I were to believe that they hadn't seen each other, it's very possible that there would be an attraction there. There's a handful of years of an age difference. I would think that as a kid, he might have had a crush on her. He called her an angel. He was fond of her. So I think
he
from
knew
his
how
end,
to woo her as a child.
From his end, it doesn't surprise me that he's crushing on her.
Oh, sure.
From her end,
that's the problem that I have. Yeah. She's now a senator, a respected senator, former queen of a planet. And then she looks at this kid and she's like, oh,
he's
Annie,
no longer a child.
How you've grown. I mean, he's still only 10 years older than he was. So he's what, 20 maybe?
Yeah.
If he were 10-ish. She's lived an adult life for a long time.
What would you say if I said this is driven by destiny? That there's something that at the chemical level, the spiritual level, a higher level, that something is drawing her to him. Because I'd even argue throughout their courtship that he isn't exactly the nicest person to her.
Let's talk about that. And I know that this is one of the things you really want to talk about, and it's what you spent a pretty good amount of time talking about on that panel at Celebration. Let's talk about the honesty of Anakin in Attack of the Clones. This is not a likable kid. He is... I'm going to go ahead and...
Wait, what?
I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use the term... he's given me incel vibes. Right?
Say more about that. What are his behaviors that make you feel that he's acting like someone who acting like an incel would act? Seems to be a sense of entitlement, that because he likes a girl, he needs to have some sort of reciprocation, and it's unfair
that she's not reciprocating. It's unfair that the world won't allow him to have this relationship. It's unfair. There's a sense of entitlement there, and he's getting more and more angry about it. And then later goes and kills an entire family of Tuscans. It's the kind of move that we have seen happen. But there is clearly something pent up in him. Now, part of that is the culture of the Jedi. The Jedi is telling him you are not allowed to have emotional attachments. But I don't think that makes him any less of a creep as a man when he addresses Padme. I mean, there's a moment when there's a kiss and then he blames her for it. Like, his feelings are all mixed up and it's your fault because you kissed him.
I wonder if you can play that conversation.
Oh, I have that conversation. Yeah.
There was a kiss that they share together, and if you watch it, he leans in and it looks somewhat mutual to me. It looks like they're both feeling it, right? In a good way. And then later they have some conversations about not being able to be together because she's a senator and he's a Jedi, on both ends, right? The Jedi, just like you said, they're not allowed to have these emotional attachments. He explains it away that actually Jedi are very compassionate and this is how they can be compassionate. Meanwhile, he's actually not a very compassionate person.
Okay.
And then
let me play this audio and then let's talk about that. So here we go.
From the moment I met you, all those years ago, not a day has gone by when I haven't thought of you. And now that I'm with you again, I'm in agony. The closer I get to you, the worse it gets. The thought of not being with you, I can't breathe. I'm haunted by the kiss that you should never have given me. My heart is beating, hoping that kiss will not become a scar. You are in my very soul, tormenting me. If you're suffering as much as I am, please tell me.
I can't. We can't. It's just not possible.
Anything is possible, Padme. Listen to me.
No, you listen. We live in a real world. Come back to it.
It's so cringy, right? Because there's elements here of gaslighting. There's elements of blaming, as you said.
For someone who is not familiar, I realize gaslighting is a pretty common term now, but for members of the audience who don't know exactly what gaslighting is, explain that concept.
It's either pathologizing someone's reactions or blaming someone's reactions when those reactions are appropriate and proportional to the situation. So in this case, she's somewhat upset and naming that they can't be together, and he is turning it on her rather than taking any accountability for the distress they might both feel or the distress that he feels. He's putting it on her, blaming her for the event, but also blaming her for how he feels. Like, it's your fault that I'm so unwell, that I'm so dysregulated, that I'm troubled, that I can't concentrate, that I can't do my job. Like, it's on you that I'm so messed up. But it also kind of makes him the victim. And I think this is where the gaslighting piece is the most apparent. Yeah. Where suddenly when he's called out, he then turns it around and becomes the victim here. Woe is me. I'm suffering. I mean, he wants her to know why did you do this to me? Because of you, I'm suffering. Yeah. And the adult response would be a little bit more of a shared responsibility. Being more authentic about how he might feel romantically, but also giving her a little bit of space to process how she actually feels. He never pays attention. And this is where I'd agree with you on the incel comment. I don't like using that word, but I totally get it when you use it, because it's like he's not taking any responsibility, but he's also basically neglecting and ignoring how she feels and how any of his words or actions might actually hurt her or impact her negatively. So it's all about him. There are a lot of people that have thought about a mental health illness related to Anakin's different features, especially as it starts in this film. Like this is the film where he spirals.
Yeah.
He's mad that someone doesn't want to give him the affection he thinks he deserves, and he spirals from here.
He loses his mother, who can no longer give him the affection that she would have, and in return, he cannot give her affection any longer.
He definitely is, and I said this on the panel the other day, that he is a high conflict person or has a high conflict personality.
What does that mean exactly?
We refer to this as an HCP, or as someone with HCP, a high conflict personality. This is essentially a pattern or a series of features that someone has when they're in pretty constant conflict with other people. Basically, it's somebody who is really hard to get along with. This pattern, let me be very clear, like all of us have had our bad days. There are times when we want to like just be snippy and salty and yell at people, or we just aren't really our nicest selves. That's not this. An HCP is someone who over the years consistently and repeatedly is in relational situations where they are unable to get along. They're in conflict with others on a regular basis.
And we see that with him and Obi-Wan, even when Obi-Wan chastises or criticizes a decision that Anakin's made, Anakin will then kind of under his breath talk about, well, you never let me do this or whatever. Like he's constantly snipping back at.
And yeah, I think while that's true, it isn't even someone who has an attitude. It is somebody who has a deeply observable set of patterns. And I'm actually going to describe some of these patterns. And I want folks, sometimes when I describe this, folks are like, wait a minute.
Is that me?
Yeah. Am I an HCP? Is that me in the group? Is that me and my family? The reality is that 1 in 10 of us are an HCP. And that's not super uncommon. A high conflict personality isn't a mental disease or mental illness. This isn't like a category or a label that refers to a particular mental illness. But sometimes these patterns can lead to a level of dysregulation or a level of distress that might be related to some mental disorders. But 1 in 10 is noticeable. So at your work, in your family, in your friend circle, maybe in your relationships romantically, maybe even your spouse, you might have an HCP. It's likely you have an HCP in your world. And I appreciate that you said, well, he's kind of annoying. He has an attitude. You don't really like him. That's one thing, but there are other features that we'll go over. One is that an HCP is constantly blaming others. They don't take any responsibility for things, especially when they go wrong. So this is the intense and, again, pretty repeated, consistent pattern of choosing to blame others for how things happen. When they're making decisions, they land in a place where it's actually other people's fault. They attack others. They fault others. And this can be anything from minor disagreements to major things in their lives. And among relationships or within relationships, that blaming can become very abusive, if that makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. Somebody who's just constantly harping on you and not taking accountability for their actions. The second thing that is common among HCPs is this all or nothing thinking. Everyone is always good or everyone is always bad. They see conflicts in particular in terms of like, there's just one solution to this. There's just one way. And we kind of see Anakin approach the relationship with Padme like this, where she's trying to not negotiate with him, but just explain to him where her limits are. And he's just like, no matter what, we just need to be together. He isn't really willing to see the bigger picture, or again, to see how this impacts her. That all or nothing thinking is also apparent in the way that he sees the other Jedi, right? They're all out to get him. They don't want what's good for him. It isn't until the main character of this movie, Palpatine, who kind of shows him some attention, where he's like, okay, again, all or nothing thinking, that person is all good, always for me, always going to have my back. The third and very primary, I'd say a very primary feature of an HCP is unmanaged emotions. So just very emotionally dysregulated, constantly manipulating other people, feeling, just like you pointed out, like someone says something, they feel triggered, they feel upset. They're emotionally very like vulnerable. And so then you see them being angry, yelling, showing disrespect. And then, finally there's the propensity for extreme behaviors. And this could be somebody who's willing to engage in violence, somebody who might be impulsive, who might throw things, who might put their hands on somebody, who would be threatening. And that has various levels of intensity. So in my mind, somebody who's abusive in a relationship would probably meet all these characteristics, but certainly would have the feature of showing extreme behaviors.
Yeah.
And you named, I was just about to say, like, what Anakin did to that Tusken community is a part of this. It's not all explained by his personality, but again, in looking at him as a high conflict person, the intensity and the extreme behavior that we see in murdering all of these people who, yes, did something to him. They kidnapped his mother. They tortured her. She eventually passed away from those injuries. He is full of rage, full of resentment, full of entitlement, and he believes that they're deserving of losing their lives.
Could I ask if this personality, you keep using the term personality, and I'm wondering, is that a nature thing? Is that a nurture thing? And of course, when we talk about this thing, I know that that there's a little of both involved, but is this a trait that is likely to appear in anyone, or is this a trait that is more likely to appear in someone who has been brought up a certain way? So if you have been given a certain amount of privilege, say, can you then be triggered and feel like you are entitled to things and feel like you want to fight for whatever? Or would someone who is maybe a little more diminutive be less likely to be HCP because they don't speak up, they don't
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, but just like any kind of personality feature or any kind of personality type, there's an interaction. So a part of these behaviors and emotional dysregulation, that comes from their experience, but it also comes with the neurobiological makeup that is in their own system. So those characteristics and those traits interact. And environment is huge. Environment is one factor, or I'd say multiple factors that lead into these deeply held beliefs. Anakin, we know, goes on to continue to do some very violent things.
But I want to think about the things that have led to this. So we've not seen this clearly, but over the last 10 years, he has been under the strict tutelage of Obi-Wan and presumably other members of the council, or certainly other members of the Jedi community. And I'm wondering what over this time has led him to be this way versus And is some of this just his background as, because we talked about Phantom Menace, we talked about the fact that, this is the most entitled slave that I've ever seen. He walks the streets and picks fights with Sebulba. He, or is at least willing to stand up to Sebulba, who's a bit of a bully. And he is willing to just he's sort of got his run of the shop at Watto's, because he is a brilliant engineer and is able to, he's a great mechanic.
What the first movie didn't show us that I imagine is happening in his life, especially in those formative years, is a sense of dehumanization. And I think had we seen more of it, it would have been a very tragic film. And what I'm talking about is his growing experiences, his internalizing of messages of himself, the future in the world, the schema that he as a slave was developing. These are the messages of being told that he's owned, that his body is not his own agency is not his own. So there's a lot of dehumanization, a lot of traumatic exposure, a lot of loneliness and isolation that he probably had in his life, given what we know factually about his situation with him and his mom, Shmi.
So talk about his reaction then when he hears that Watto sold his mother a while back.
That brings him right back to their sense of their own value, him and his mother, knowing that fundamentally they're seen as objects, they're seen as currency, they're not seen as human beings. And so I'd imagine that stirs up in him some of those original schema. You're owned. You don't have control of your own self. And not only that, but what happens to you and your family is up to people who have power.
Yeah.
So all those things come up for him. We don't see this as much in the first movie, but in the second movie, we start to get a sense of his bitterness, his sense of resentment, and fundamentally the emotional reactions that he has in learning what's happened to his mother, and also in understanding how he's being treated among the folks at the Jedi Council.
So where he doesn't have the power there, he is willing to be the most powerful here when given an opportunity to express his anger.
Right. It's a dangerous combination, because it's like, we're going to train you to be a fighter. We're going to give you this vicious weapon. We're going to, limit how you regulate and learn about emotions. We're really never going to teach you how to manage your emotions. We'll simply tell you, don't have them. Don't explore them. And I think there are some Jedi that do this differently. I don't mean to generalize, but the way that he internalized those messages was fundamentally really bad for him. He's not well. And I'd say that when I think about his lifestyle and his experience, there are some connections to the people in our world who eventually engage in mass shootings or have this extremist, violent profile. Not exactly one-to-one, but you start to see, especially for young men in particular, people will always, and right now this debate is ongoing. It's been ongoing for years. They always go back to it's a mental health issue. And I think on the show, again, we have to tackle that and do our due diligence and say, like, well, mental health is only a part of this.
Right.
In fact, all the things we've been talking about, extremist beliefs and values, a sense of entitlement, deep bitterness, anger, isolation, those things have little to do with a particular mental illness.
And by the way, we should point out, because there are listeners, when we say entitlement to, it doesn't mean that you deserve this because you for free or whatever. Even if you've worked hard for it, you feel you deserve it. And that is still a form of entitlement. I just want to make sure that we're not throwing out blanket terms that I know, and sometimes, triggers certain people. But just as you have said and made it a point in the past to say that you could have a deeply troubling diagnosis, but if handled properly, nothing will.
No, I mean, even where you're going with this, I'd pause and say, actually, and there's a lot of research that backs this up, that about 4% of community violence is directly related to mental illness.
Yeah.
In fact, when we talk about mental illness, in particular, mental health disorders, we're talking about anxiety disorders, depression, ADHD. We're talking about serious mental illness sometimes, like schizophrenia. And taken together, even if you lump all of those categories together, that those are not the driving forces for violence.
Right.
Actually, folks who have mental illness are more likely to be victims of violence, not criminals.
Yeah.
It's hard for our society to wrap their heads around this, because we think, gosh, for someone to pick up a lightsaber and destroy an entire community, for someone to pick up a weapon and murder a classroom of children. When we think about this, we think, well, that must be mental illness, and we've got to be really careful.
Because no sane person would do that. Meanwhile, of course, he was a sane person. He planned it. He knew he was going to do it.
Most of those individuals, and by the way, they tend to be young and male, but most of those individuals, we'd say they're troubled. Yeah, we could say they've gone wayward, or that they're thinking in a way that we would not think. But there isn't a single mental illness that really captures their personality, behavior, and emotional features.
Yeah. I think I go back when I was saying before, I go back to that episode where you diagnosed potentially the Joker as saying, that he was right there with that, not borderline, but antisocial personality disorder, that you would sort of lean toward that. And that led a father to ask, my son, who was just diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, is he going to become the Joker? And you were quick to say, no, absolutely not. That's not, it's a very serious diagnosis, but at the same time, very manageable, very treatable, and is not going to lead your son to become the quote unquote insane clown prince of crime. You're not, the mental illness does not lead you to do this.
The hindsight bias we have is so powerful here, right? We can look back on Facebook posts and Instagram posts and visits to hospitals and be like, wow, that person, look at the way they're speaking, look at the way that people were worried about them. But the reality is that 1 in 4 of us do have a mental disorder. That's a lot of us. So it isn't a direct causation. Does it mean that some folks who engage in community violence have a history of mental illness? Yes, some do, but the majority of them do not. And so we have to tie it back. If we think about Anakin, for instance, we need to tie it back to this development of deeply held extremist beliefs. What would drive someone to domestic or planetary terrorism? What would drive someone to destroy an entire community of this race of people? So this is supremacy. This is racism. This is extreme hatred. This is extremist fixed beliefs, and there aren't a lot of people around him to correct him. Now you have the opportunity at the Jedi Council to recognize what's happening to this wayward kid, but instead you have this elder who sees a weakness in him and who begins grooming him. Right.
And you're talking about Palpatine. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the elder who now sees a weakness which is ultimately going to become a strength for him, and his grooming of Anakin. Talk a little bit about Palpatine.
What did we see in episode 2 of Palpatine? Because they haven't quite developed the relationship that we're going to see a little bit later where they have that pivotal conversation, right? But I think we start to see the beginning of that.
This movie, yes, because at the end of the first movie, Phantom Menace, Palpatine looks down at young Anakin and says, "We're going to keep our eye on your career." Yeah. And it's a wink and a nod to the audience that realizes who Palpatine is. If you know the name Palpatine, this is going to be a big deal. But ultimately, in the second movie, it's mostly the politics again, with him ultimately using Senate Representative Jar Jar Binks to basically give him emergency powers to create a clone army that is intended to help the Jedi maintain peace throughout the galaxy. And so it's mostly that interaction. And then we also see him interacting with the other side. I mean, Palpatine is literally playing both sides. Not just playing both sides, he's leading both sides. He is actively leading.
This film actually kind of gets really, I don't know, confusing with the building of the clone army, and then the droid army is going to fight them, and it's like, why? I mean, later we learn that the clone army is his long con. Building the clone army, these thousands of identical men that are going to then become Palpatine's personal military. That makes sense to me. And what's interesting is that they're using clone technology to make sure not only that you have the right kind of personality type to be this militant,
someone who will take orders.
Absolutely.
And I think I like that you said absolutely is they will take orders absolutely.
So when it comes time,
they will not question orders.
Right. So when it comes time, they even have that particular Order 66 chip. When it comes time to then turn on the Jedi, which we don't technically know about yet, but it's important because they are genetically engineered to eventually help Palpatine own the universe and destroy the Jedi. So this is an ongoing kind of longer power move, but I think that Palpatine recognizes that Anakin can be a player in this.
What I find interesting about the clones in general, and we did have someone email us talking about their excitement about the fact that we were going to talk about the clones. You're right. They have chosen someone whose DNA is primed for this. He is a perfect specimen of a warrior. He is also, they are basically raising these clone children to be the perfect specimens of those who take orders, those who can deliver orders that are necessary, etc. They are essentially mindless soldiers. But what's interesting is even Palpatine recognizes that these clones may not execute Order 66 unless there's a chip implanted in them that forces them to. Like even those clones know the difference between a good order and a bad order. And so it's interesting because while you were talking about this on the panel and the other panelists, I'm sitting there thinking, why do you need the chip if you have literally cloned this army to take every order you give them without question? And it really ultimately comes down to a good soldier knows the difference between a good order and a bad order.
Yeah.
They're not going to turn on their Jedi brethren with whom they've been fighting the Clone Wars with, if it seems like an unjust order. And of course, we look at the Clone Wars TV series and we see that each one of those characters has their own personality. Sure. And they've done different things with their uniforms.
You can't really have a clone army because your environment, even though your genetics are the same, everyone still has a different environment. And so these little idiosyncrasies in their personalities are going to emerge. And this movie and the next movie doesn't really handle this well, but the Clone Wars animation series and then the Bad Batch handles this much better, where you start to see the emergence of these unique personalities and how their social interpersonal environment actually does impact their own development emotionally and personally.
Why is Django a bad
dad?
Yes, but why is Django a
That's the next show, Bad Dad.
Bad Dad.
Django Bad Dad.
Why is Django a bad source of DNA for this clone army? Like, is there something, or why is he a good, I mean, I think we know why he's a good source. He's a mercenary.
Well, the one thing we know about him is that he was willing to do it.
Yeah.
And I don't know, of course, maybe for
and he's getting paid
right for
as,
any price.
You know,
maybe that makes sense, but
but he's being given a son. He wants to be a father.
Yeah.
And so he has commissioned them to create Boba Fett, but not genetically alter him to grow up super fast. So Boba is growing at the speed of a child, which you have some things to say about, because he is now watching other children that look just like him grow up faster than him and become bigger than him and become soldiers. Mm-hmm. And it leaves him disconnected from these people who have surrounded him. And by the way, those people also all look like his dad. And
him. But eventually, as they get to adulthood, they all look like his dad.
He doesn't necessarily recognize that he'll look like his dad, but he sees all these other people who look like him grow up to look exactly like his dad.
That's right. I forgot that they all grow up super fast. They have this accelerated development.
But the deal is that Boba is left to grow up naturally.
None of this is natural, but
well,
I hear what you're saying.
So talk about this. Like, let's talk about these characters.
Yeah, he's Boba Fett is experiencing psychic disequilibrium on a regular basis. This is the feeling of kind of like not really being there, but not being there. Kind of there's an actual quote where this feeling, this phenomenon is that in which we feel we're looking into a mirror but not really seeing ourselves. It's like seeing other people, being part of a community, but sort of being invisible. And you might say, how is that possible? He's got thousands of people around him that basically are him, that share his genetic makeup, but something about that, the uniformity, the homogeneity, the isolation of this situation for him probably leads to a lot of loneliness and a lot of confusion. And who does he have who is a child like him? Who's like him? So that loneliness is really apparent. The other piece of this is how nurtured he feels by his own father. And I get a sense that there's like a loyalty, a camaraderie, some familial connection there, but it doesn't feel that it's one of nurturing and love. They're in a military camp. Like, it just seems. And
hold on. I've been raised in the military.
I know. I know you grew up in a
on a
military residence.
Post. Uh-huh.
But you weren't. It's as if you were on the training base,
exactly,
day and night, surrounded by adults.
Yeah.
So I imagine he'll grow up to learn what they learn, and he'll. And I'm trying not to jump ahead because I know we've seen him in other shows, but he will likely rebel a bit from who he's supposed to be. But I bet there's a lot of confusion and loneliness that is attached to this role that he has as like the only real boy.
Especially after the end of this movie where we watch his father get beheaded by Mace Windu. And then you've got the sad little moment of little Boba picking up Django's helmet and staring at it. And it's another one of those winks and nods to us who then realize that he's looking at the helmet that he'll eventually wear. he'll repaint and wear that helmet and become a Mandalorian and all that. But yeah, now you've got this kid who's also going to suffer some form of trauma, having watched his father, who in his eyes is the pinnacle of warriordom. You know, he's even helped his father in battle. We watch as they fly Slave One, and they fire off the little Sonic mine and all that stuff.
I think he's also going to internalize a sense of hate for the Jedi.
Yeah, because
that's what these folks feel. I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot here around staying with your own kind and not, and feeling superior or against, in contrast to other groups of people. Mm-hmm. And of course, as we're going to see, that builds up to this ongoing war that they have.
Mm-hmm. I think we can save some of our conversations, particularly about the clones, for the next movie. I think we can save some of the conversations, particularly about Palpatine, as we're going to see a whole lot more of him and a whole lot more of his motivations for the next movie. And there's a very specific conversation I want to have with you about the relationship between Obi-Wan and Anakin, but I want to save that for the next movie as well. There's a specific line of dialogue, in fact, that I want to bring up in that conversation. So right now, I just want to ask you, Drea, having now watched the movie, having had a conversation with a number of panelists about it, and then also having this conversation here today, what are your thoughts on Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones?
I feel like I like this movie a little bit more now that we've seen it age a little bit. Mm-hmm. I certainly cannot find myself really understanding the love that grows between Anakin and Padme, but for what it's worth, I do appreciate this movie, and it starts to fit well with the beliefs and understandings that I have about the story of Anakin. This is an important thing for me because I very much like Anakin as a character. I like his journey. I like him as Darth Vader. I'm compelled around this person. Even before we had the prequels, right? This is a character who has this significant history.
But you're also talking about Anakin. I just mistook that. You're talking about Anakin, the character. You're not talking about Hayden Christensen, the actor portraying this character.
I mean, that is Anakin.
Yeah.
By the way, could have been Leonardo DiCaprio.
There are a number of people that it could have been.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like there were a number of actors that could have been played by or could have been Anakin. Leonardo DiCaprio was one of them. There was also, if I remember correctly, Paul Walker was in the list. Ryan Felipe was in the list. Who else? Topher Grace has said that he was in the list. I think Jonathan Brandis, if you remember Jonathan Brandis, was in the list. Colin Hanks, I think, was on. I mean, there are a lot of people, but also if you think about a number of those people, they also kind of remind you of maybe Ewan McGregor from the first movie. Like they probably would have been very, very similar.
I don't mind, gosh, there's a lot of criticism about Hayden Christensen in this role. He does what he needs to do here in this particular film, which is to show us how he cannot tolerate these difficult emotions. He has this internal dysfunction, and he has what HCPs have, this lack of individual reflection, lack of awareness. He doesn't realize that what he's doing is harmful.
Yeah.
There is I wonder, I know it's hard, this is a hard piece, but I wonder if you can play the moment that he's telling Padme about what he had done to the Tusken Raider camp.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
It's important.
Yeah. Here we go. Let me pull it up here, and here we go.
You're not all powerful.
Well, I should be. Someday I will be. I will be the most powerful Jedi ever. I promise you. I will even learn to stop people from dying.
Anakin.
It's all Obi-Wan's fault. He's jealous. He's holding me back.
What's wrong, Annie?
I killed them. I killed them all. They're dead. Every single one of them. And not just the men, but the women. And the children, too. They're like animals. And I slaughtered them like animals. I hate them.
To be angry is to be human.
I'm a Jedi. I know I'm better than this.
It's extremely sad because on the one hand, he recognizes that what he did was massively violent. And also a part of what's coming out emotionally is that they were deserving of it. Mm-hmm. And what comes up for me is that, again, going back to how I feel about this character overall, this Anakin character who eventually becomes Darth Vader, is that
we don't know that.
Well, okay. This Anakin Skywalker is that we are intrigued by his descent, and we have a willingness to follow this path, to follow this journey. Look, a lot of us know where this is going to end up. But we are, I don't know, there's a sense of our own human forgiveness around what's going on. How can we make this story make sense for us? I do know that there might be people still listening thinking like, so am I an HCP? Like it's still swirling in their head. One thing to make clear is that I said 1 out of 10, and actually nowadays 2 out of 10. This is more common now. 2 out of 10 people are HCPs. Most HCPs are not engaging in extreme violence like this. That is very, very rare. But the other piece to think about too is that if you're wondering if you're that person, you're probably not that person, because there is a complete lack of awareness. There's no insight. There's no willingness to change. There's a
Is it weird that I didn't ask myself if I was until now?
That's weird.
Now I'm wondering if I'm that person.
It also, by the way, to kind of stay in the HCP territory, it's not a good idea. I know folks are like, okay, I've got to do something about this. I've got to tell somebody in my life that they're an HCP. What we need to do in this case is take a strategy called private working theory. You have a private working theory that someone in your life is an HCP. By God, do not go up to that person and say, I just learned something. You're an HCP. Or I just read a book called It's All Your Fault, and I'm going to give you that book. By the way, that's a real book. I recommend it.
Now I realize what's wrong with you.
Please
You're an
don't
HCP.
do this. This does not help, as you can imagine, the situation. It will only inflame and amplify the blaming, the all or nothing thinking, the gaslighting. So take that different kind of internal working theory or private working theory approach. How can you now use this lens to interact with that person in a way that protects you, serves you, and also doesn't label that person, doesn't pathologize that person? Because again, this isn't a mental health disorder, but it's a personality type. Mm-hmm. Maybe at the next episode, we'll talk more about that, but I did want to give that recommendation to folks who are coming out of this episode and realizing someone in their life meets this kind of profile around being a high conflict person, and they're unsure what to do with that information.
Yeah. I did sort of jokingly bring up Hayden Christensen as Anakin and his performance, and I did that for a reason. There's been a lot of talk about the Obi-Wan Kenobi show that is currently on. We've now seen 4 episodes of it. We've got 2 more to go. And there has been a significant backlash against one of the show's stars, Moses Ingram, who plays Reva, the third sister. And there's been a lot of complaints about her performance in this show, and a lot of that has been from the quote unquote hardcore Star Wars fans who just don't feel like she's up to par. And I just have to remind folks that this is a franchise that had Academy Award winners and nominees and future nominees and winners in the cast, and they still sounded wooden and cardboardy. Hayden Christensen delivers lines like this.
I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere. Not like here. Here everything is soft and smooth.
And this is a person that you were excited was coming back to this TV show. So I just need everyone to check themselves, go back and look at some of the performances in this melodrama.
I'd even say I don't even. Those aren't fans of Star Wars. Those are people that look. I mean, we actually named some of the characteristics that might also be common amongst this tiny sliver of the fandom,
of the people who
that feel entitled, that feel resentful, that feel they're owed something.
Yeah.
Maybe they're HCPs. I'm not going to get into that territory, but I also feel it is unlikely that showing facts and giving evidence that might dissuade them actually won't have that much of an impact.
Yeah. Well, we, the Arkham Sessions, stand with Moses, and we wish her the best and much success in the Star Wars universe.
I am actually really enjoying. I know we're not supposed to be talking about it, but I am enjoying the new Obi-Wan show.
Oh yeah. Okay. All right. We'll maybe we'll talk about. Maybe we'll give the listeners an opportunity to vote on that as well. All right. So, Drea, why don't you let the folks know where they can find you online?
You can find me on my website, drdreapsychology.com, and on social media at Arkham Asylum Doc.
You can find me on Twitter at bward028. You can find me on Instagram at b_ward028. You can find me. You can find us both on Twitter at Arkham Sessions and on Instagram at the Arkham Sessions. Come find us on Facebook and come join us on Patreon. We've got some folks to thank for their contributions. Josh Ekus, Michael Pruitt, Weffy, Eric O'Sullivan, Rachel Acevedo Huffman, Zach Neal, Zachary Hunter, Mike Blanchard, Dr. Girlfriend, John Henry, Nick Gilbert, Dr. Jerome Anderson, Antonio Lopez, Jay Griffin Hughes, Todd Stashwick, Scott the Therapist, Frank Moeller, Mark Pepper, and Swaras Ali. Thank you all for your contributions. You too can have your name called out in an episode of the Arkham Sessions. Just go to patreon.com /Arkham Sessions and sign up for that tier. I believe it's a $5 tier. Get your name shout out. We want to thank all of our family over at Fanbase Press. I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Drea Letamendi.
And together we are
the Arkham Sessions.
If Master Obi-Wan caught me doing this, he'd be very grumpy.